I never thought I'd be sitting in my lawyer's office at 72 years old, holding a stack of credit card statements that weren't mine, watching my daughter-in-law's financial house of cards finally collapse. The burgundy leather chair felt cold against my back as I stared at the numbers that had destroyed my family's trust. $47,000 in secret debt, all traced back to purchases my son knew nothing about, all funded by credit cards opened in accounts linked to the family business my late husband had built from nothing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Just 3 hours earlier, I'd been standing in my kitchen, coffee-stained and humiliated, while my daughter-in-law Rachel smirked at me with that same expression she'd worn for the past 2 years. The same look she'd given me every time she accidentally spilled something on me, bumped into me, or found some other petty way to make me feel unwelcome in my own son's life. But this time was different. This time, her little performance had pushed me too far, and I'd finally done something about it. The coffee had been scalding hot, just like always. Rachel never seemed to have trouble with temperature control when she was drinking it herself. But somehow, every time I was within 10 feet of her, physics seemed to work differently. The dark liquid had splashed across my white silk blouse, the one I'd bought specifically for today's family brunch, and the pain had shot through my chest like fire. But it wasn't the physical burn that finally broke something inside me. It was the way she'd laughed afterward, that musical little giggle she reserved for moments when she thought she was clever. The morning had started like so many others over the past 2 years, with me trying to navigate the minefield that family gatherings had become since Rachel married my son David. I'd been looking forward to today's brunch at their sprawling colonial house in Millbrook Heights, one of those perfectly manicured suburbs where every lawn looked like it belonged in a magazine, and every family seemed to have stepped out of a catalog. David had called me 3 days earlier, his voice warm with the kind of excitement I hadn't heard since he was a child. "Mom, you have to come over Sunday," he'd said, and I could hear Rachel's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. "Rachel's making that French toast you love, and we have some news to share. Big news." My heart had fluttered with hope. After 2 years of tension, maybe Rachel was finally ready to accept me as part of the family. Maybe she'd realized that I wasn't trying to interfere in their marriage, that I simply wanted to maintain the close relationship I'd always had with my son. David was all I had left since my husband Frank had passed 5 years ago, and the distance Rachel had created between us felt like losing another piece of my heart. I'd spent Saturday afternoon at the boutique downtown, choosing the perfect outfit for what I hoped would be a new beginning. The white silk blouse had cost more than I usually spent on clothes, but something about its elegant drape and the way it brought out my silver hair made me feel confident, polished. I'd even splurged on a new pair of pearl earrings, the kind Frank used to say made my eyes sparkle. I wanted to look like the kind of mother-in-law any woman would be proud to have, the kind who could contribute to family celebrations rather than merely attend them. Sunday morning had dawned crisp and clear, one of those perfect October days when the leaves seemed to glow like stained glass windows. I'd driven through Millbrook Heights slowly, admiring the way the morning light played across the expensive homes, each one more impressive than the last. David and Rachel's house sat at the end of Sycamore Lane, a modern colonial with glossy black shutters and a front door painted the exact shade of red that Martha Stewart had declared fashionable that year. The circular driveway was already filled, with cars I didn't recognize, which struck me as odd. David had said it would be just the 3 of us for brunch. The confusion deepened when Rachel answered the door wearing a flowing sundress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Her auburn hair was styled in perfect waves, and her makeup looked professionally done. This wasn't the casual family brunch I'd been expecting. This looked like she was hosting a magazine photo shoot. "Oh, Margaret," she'd said, using the formal version of my name that she knew I disliked. "You're here. Not welcome, or how lovely to see you, or any of the dozens of warm greetings that normal daughters-in-law might use. Just an acknowledgement of my presence, delivered with the same tone she might use to comment on an unexpected rainstorm. "David invited me," I'd replied, trying to keep my voice light. "He said you had news to share." Rachel's smile had the sharp edge of broken glass. "Oh yes, we certainly do. Come in, come in. Everyone's already here." Everyone. The word had sent a chill through me as I followed her into the house. The living room was full of people I didn't recognize, all holding mimosas and laughing at some shared joke. There were couples about David and Rachel's age, a few older women who looked like they belonged to the same country club, and several children running around with the kind of carefree energy that comes from knowing you're welcome wherever you are. "David's in the kitchen," Rachel had said, gesturing vaguely toward the back of the house. "He's been so busy with the preparations. Why don't you go find him?" I'd made my way through the crowd, smiling politely at strangers who looked through me as if I were invisible. The kitchen was a showpiece of marble countertops and professional-grade appliances, the kind of space that belonged in a cooking magazine. David stood at the center island, arranging pastries on a silver platter with the focused concentration he'd inherited from his father. He looked up as I entered, and his face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Mom, you look beautiful," he'd said, coming around the island to give me a hug. "I love that blouse. Very elegant." For a moment, surrounded by his familiar warmth, I'd felt like everything might be okay. This was my son, the little boy who used to bring me dandelions and call them bouquets, the teenager who'd insisted I teach him to dance before his senior prom, the young man who'd held my hand at his father's funeral and promised we'd always take care of each other. "What's the occasion?" I'd asked, gesturing toward the crowd in the living room. "You said it would be just us for brunch." David's expression had shifted slightly, a flicker of something that might have been discomfort crossing his features. "Rachel thought it would be nice to include some friends. You know how she loves entertaining." I did know. In the 2 years since their wedding, Rachel had thrown elaborate parties for every conceivable occasion: birthday celebrations, holiday gatherings, seasonal soirees that seemed to exist for no reason other than to show off their beautiful home and expensive lifestyle. I was rarely invited to these events, and when I was, I always felt like an afterthought, a duty invitation extended out of obligation rather than desire. "And the news?" I'd prompted, hoping it might be something wonderful enough to explain the party atmosphere. "We'll make the announcement after brunch," David had said, but there was something in his tone that made me think he wasn't entirely comfortable with whatever was coming. "Rachel has it all planned out." Of course she did. Rachel always had. Everything planned out, usually in ways that made me feel like an outsider looking in. I'd learned not to ask too many questions about her plans, having discovered that curiosity was often interpreted as interference. The next hour had passed, in a blur of polite conversation with people who clearly knew each other well, but had no idea who I was. I'd tried to contribute to discussions about vacation destinations I'd never visited, restaurants I couldn't afford, and social events I'd never been invited to. Every time I'd mentioned something about David's childhood or shared a memory from our family's past, the conversation would shift away from me so smoothly it was like watching a magic trick. Rachel had been the perfect hostess, gliding through the room with a crystal pitcher of mimosas, refilling glasses and accepting compliments on her beautiful home, her delicious food, her impeccable taste in everything. She'd managed to avoid me entirely until the moment she'd approached with that coffee pot, her smile bright and her eyes cold. "Margaret, you look a little tired," she'd said, loud enough for several nearby guests to hear. "Would you like some coffee? It's a special blend David picked up from that new place downtown. Very strong." I'd nodded gratefully, thinking that caffeine might help me feel more alert, more present in this room full of strangers. Rachel had poured carefully, the dark liquid streaming into the delicate china cup with precision. Then she'd stepped closer, as if to hand me the cup personally, and somehow her elbow had bumped the pot just enough to send the scalding coffee splashing across my chest. The pain had been immediate and intense, but it was nothing compared to the humiliation of standing there dripping while a room full of strangers stared at me. Rachel had immediately launched into what I'd come to recognize as her performance of concern, gasping and exclaiming about how clumsy she was, how sorry she felt, how these things just seemed to happen around me. "Oh my goodness, Margaret, I'm so sorry," she'd cried, grabbing a kitchen towel and dabbing at my ruined blouse in a way that somehow made the stain worse. "I don't know what's wrong with me today. I've been so nervous about our announcement that I can barely hold anything." Steady. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Several guests had murmured sympathetic comments about accidents happening, about how unfortunate it was, about how understanding I was being about the whole situation. But I'd caught the look in Rachel's eyes as she'd handed me the towel, that flash of satisfaction that told me this had been no accident at all. This was the third time in 2 months that Rachel had accidentally spilled something on me. There had been the red wine at David's birthday dinner, which had ruined my favorite dress and forced me to leave early. Then the tomato sauce incident at their Labor Day barbecue, which had sent me home to change and effectively removed me from the remainder of the party. Now this, timed perfectly to humiliate me in front of a room full of her friends. But something about today felt different. Maybe it was the fact that she'd done it in front of so many witnesses, or maybe it was the way she'd laughed afterward, that little musical sound that made my skin crawl. Or maybe it was simply that I'd reached the end of my patience with being treated like an unwelcome guest in my own son's life. "I think I should go home and change," I'd said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the burning sensation across my chest and the burning humiliation in my cheeks. "Oh no, don't leave," Rachel had exclaimed, but her tone held no real conviction. "I'm sure we can find you something to wear, though I'm not sure anything of mine would fit you." The comment had been delivered with such casual cruelty that several nearby guests had looked uncomfortable. I'd been the same size for the past decade, a perfectly normal figure for a woman my age, but Rachel had a gift for making me feel oversized and out of place in her perfectly coordinated world. "I should go," I'd repeated, heading toward the front door with as much dignity as I could muster. "Wait, Mom," David had called after me, appearing at my elbow with concern written across his face. "Are you sure you're okay? Maybe you should sit down for a minute." "I'm fine, sweetheart," I'd lied, patting his arm. "Just need to get out of these wet clothes. You stay and enjoy your party. We can talk about your news later." I'd made it to my car before the tears started, sitting in the driveway of my son's beautiful house with coffee stains spreading across my beautiful blouse, feeling smaller and more invisible than I had since Frank died. This wasn't the first time Rachel had made me feel unwelcome, but it was the first time she'd done it so publicly, so deliberately, with such obvious pleasure in my discomfort. As I'd driven home through the tree-lined streets of Millbrook Heights, past all those perfect houses with their perfect families, something had crystallized in my mind. This wasn't about coffee or clumsiness or accidents. This was about power, about territory, about Rachel's determination to erase me from David's. Life one humiliation at a time. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been paying attention to more than just her treatment of me. I'd been noticing things about their lifestyle, their spending, their mysteriously expanding collection of expensive possessions. I'd been wondering how a dental hygienist and a junior marketing executive could afford a house in Millbrook Heights, designer furniture, luxury cars, and constant entertaining. I'd been asking myself questions that a devoted mother might ask when she suspected her son was being taken advantage of. And now, sitting in that coffee-stained blouse in the parking lot of my own modest apartment complex, I'd decided it was time to find some answers. Frank had always said that the truth has a way of surfacing when you know where to look for it, and he'd taught me exactly where to look when it came to financial matters. As the widow of a small business owner, I understood more about money, credit, and financial investigation than Rachel probably realized. The decision had formed in my mind like ice crystallizing on a winter window, clear and sharp and unbreakable. I was going to find out exactly how David and Rachel were funding their perfect life, and if what I suspected was true, I was going to make sure my son knew about it before it destroyed him. Rachel wanted to play games with coffee and humiliation? Fine. But I was about to show her what happened when you underestimated a woman who'd spent 50 years managing a family business and learning to protect the people she loved. The coffee stains on my blouse were already setting by the time I reached my apartment, but I hardly noticed. My mind was racing with plans, with possibilities, with the kind of focused determination I hadn't felt since the dark days after Frank's death, when I'd had to learn to navigate the world alone. Rachel thought she could make me disappear from David's life through a series of small cruelties and public humiliations. She was about to discover just how wrong she was. The first thing I did when I got home was change out of that ruined blouse and put it in cold water to soak. The coffee stains might be salvageable, but my patience with Rachel's behavior was permanently damaged. I stood in my bathroom, looking at myself in the mirror, and saw something I hadn't seen in years reflected back at me. Not the grieving widow who'd been trying to stay small and unobtrusive. Not the desperate mother-in-law hoping for acceptance. I saw the woman who'd helped Frank build his construction business from a single truck and a dream into the most respected contracting company in 3 counties. That woman knew how to ask hard questions and find real answers. I made myself a sandwich and sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop, the same one David had insisted on buying me last Christmas when he'd said I needed to get with the times. At the time, I thought it was sweet how he wanted to help me stay connected. Now I wondered if Rachel had been behind that gift, wanting to make sure I had something to occupy my time so I'd stop wanting to spend it with them. Frank had always handled the business finances, but that didn't mean I was ignorant about money. I'd been the one who'd organized his receipts, filed his tax documents, and caught the accounting errors that could have cost us thousands over the years. More importantly, I'd been the one who'd dealt with the aftermath when Frank's business partner had tried to embezzle money by creating false vendor accounts. I'd learned then that financial deception always leaves a trail, and I'd learned exactly how to follow it. The first step was understanding David and Rachel's legitimate income. David worked at Peterson Marketing Group downtown, a mid-sized agency that handled local businesses and small regional clients. I'd looked up the company's website after he'd gotten the job 2 years ago, proud to see his name listed among their account executives. The salary range for his position, based on what I could find online, was somewhere between $45,000 and $60,000 annually. Decent money, but not enough for Millbrook Heights. Rachel worked part-time as a dental hygienist at Dr. Morrison's practice, the same dentist who'd been cleaning my teeth for 15 years. When I'd mentioned to Dr. Morrison that my daughter-in-law worked there, he'd praised her professionalism, but had also mentioned that she only worked 3 days a week. Dental hygienists in our area typically earned about $35 an hour, which meant Rachel was probably bringing in somewhere around $25,000 per year. Combined, their household income was likely around $80,000 before taxes. After taxes, insurance, and all the other deductions, they were probably taking home about $60,000. In most parts of our city, that would provide a comfortable middle-class lifestyle. In Millbrook Heights, where the average home cost over $400,000, it should have left them struggling to make mortgage payments, let alone fund the lifestyle I'd been witnessing. Yet somehow, David and Rachel were living like people who earned twice their actual income. The house alone must have cost them $5,000 a month in mortgage payments, property taxes, and insurance. Then there was Rachel's car, a brand new BMW that I'd seen her driving to family gatherings. David had upgraded from his reliable Honda to a luxury SUV sometime last year. The furniture in their house was the kind you saw in expensive magazines, not the kind young couples bought at discount stores while they saved for their future. I opened a new browser tab and began researching public records. Property deeds, mortgage information, and tax assessments were all available online if you knew where to look. What I found made my stomach clench with worry. David and Rachel had purchased their house 18 months ago for $420,000, with a down payment of only 5%. Their monthly mortgage payment, including taxes and insurance, was just over $3,000. That alone consumed more than half their take-home income, leaving less than $2,000 per month for everything else. No responsible lender should have approved that mortgage based on their documented income, which meant either they'd lied on their application or there was income I didn't know about. I spent the next hour researching both their cars. The BMW was a lease, which explained how Rachel could afford to drive something so expensive, but even lease payments on a car like that would run at least $600 per month. David's SUV was financed, with payments that likely exceeded $400 monthly. Between the house and the cars, they were spending over $4,000 each month on basic expenses, leaving them nothing for food, utilities, entertainment, or the constant stream of expensive purchases I'd observed. Yet they weren't living like people in financial distress. Rachel threw elaborate parties with catered food and premium alcohol. She wore designer clothes and carried handbags that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Their house was furnished with pieces that I recognized from high-end catalogs, the kind of furniture that came with payment plans because normal people couldn't afford to buy it outright. Something was very wrong with this picture, and my mother's instinct told me that David might not be aware of just how wrong it was. I made a cup of tea and continued my research, this time focusing on Rachel's spending patterns on social media. She wasn't particularly careful about privacy settings, and her Instagram account was a gallery of expensive experiences and luxury purchases. There were photos from spa weekends at exclusive resorts, dinners at restaurants where appetizers cost more than I typically spent on an entire meal, shopping trips that seemed to happen weekly rather than seasonally. Each photo was carefully curated to project an image of effortless prosperity. Rachel with champagne flutes at charity galas, Rachel in designer workout clothes at an upscale gym, Rachel displaying fresh flower arrangements that clearly came from the most expensive florist in town rather than the grocery store like mine did. The lifestyle she was documenting was the lifestyle of someone who earned 2 or 3 times what she and David actually made. The more I scrolled through her posts, the more convinced I became that David was being deceived about their financial situation. He'd always been trusting, sometimes to a fault. In high school, he'd loaned money to friends who never paid him back. In college, he'd been the one who picked up dinner checks and forgot to collect when people promised to pay him back later. He'd inherited his father's generous heart, but not Frank's suspicious nature when it came to money. Frank had always said that when someone's lifestyle doesn't match their income, there are only 3 possibilities. They have family money, they're going into debt, or they're getting money from somewhere they shouldn't be. I knew Rachel didn't come from wealth. Her family lived in a modest neighborhood across town, and her father worked at the post office while her mother cleaned houses. That eliminated the first possibility, which left debt or deception. I decided to start with debt, partly because it was easier to research and partly because I hoped that's all it was. Credit card debt was survivable. People recovered from financial mistakes all the time. But if Rachel was getting money through fraud or theft, the consequences would be far more serious for David. The challenge was that I couldn't access their credit reports or bank statements directly. But Frank had taught me that financial information often leaked into public records in unexpected ways. Court filings, tax lines, bankruptcy proceedings, and civil judgments were all matters of public record. I spent another hour searching databases, looking for any legal actions involving either David or Rachel. What I found was a collection of small claims court filings that painted a troubling picture. Rachel had been sued twice in the past year, by credit card companies seeking judgment for unpaid debts. The amounts weren't enormous, $3,000 in one case and $2,500 in another. But they suggested a pattern of borrowing money she couldn't repay. Both cases had been resolved, presumably through payment plans, but they indicated that Rachel's credit was already damaged. David's name didn't appear on any of the court documents, which meant either he wasn't aware of Rachel's debt problems or she'd been careful to keep the accounts in her name only. I hoped it was the latter, because it would mean David might be protected from the worst consequences of her financial irresponsibility. But my research into property records had revealed something that made me suspect David might not be as protected as I hoped. When I'd looked up the mortgage information for their house, both names were on the deed and the loan documents. If Rachel defaulted on other debts, creditors might still be able to place liens against jointly owned property. David could lose his home because of debts he didn't even know existed. The thought of my son losing everything because he'd trusted the wrong person made my chest tight with anxiety. Frank had worked so hard to provide David with a stable foundation, to teach him the value of honest work and careful planning. We'd saved money for his college education, helped him with his first apartment, given him every advantage we could manage on a small business owner's income. The idea that a woman he loved and trusted might be gambling away his future was almost unbearable. I closed my laptop and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot of my apartment complex. The contrast between my modest surroundings and David and Rachel's luxury lifestyle felt starker than ever. I'd chosen this place after Frank died because it was affordable and safe, because I wanted to live within my means and preserve what Frank had left me. I'd driven the same reliable car for 8 years, bought my clothes at department stores rather than boutiques, and carefully budgeted every expense. Not because I had to, exactly. Frank's life insurance and the sale of the business had left me comfortable enough to live more extravagantly if I'd chosen to. But because I'd learned the value of financial security, the peace of mind that came from knowing you could handle unexpected expenses without panic, I'd wanted David to learn those same values, to understand that real wealth came from living below your means rather than above them. Instead, he seemed to be trapped in a lifestyle that required constant financial stress to maintain, married to a woman who might be willing to destroy both their futures to preserve her image of prosperity. I needed more information before I could approach David with my concerns. Accusations without proof would only drive him away, especially if Rachel had already been working to distance him from me. I needed concrete evidence that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. The next morning, I called Dr. Morrison's office and made an appointment for a dental cleaning. I'd had one just 6 months ago, earlier than usually recommended, but I told his receptionist that I'd been having some sensitivity issues and wanted to be checked. It wasn't entirely a lie. The stress of yesterday's confrontation had left me grinding my teeth all night. Dr. Morrison had been my dentist for 15 years, and we'd developed the kind of comfortable professional relationship that allowed for casual conversation during procedures. I'd helped him with some minor renovation work on his office a few years back, connecting him with reliable contractors from Frank's old network. He trusted me, and I hoped that trust would extend to sharing some general information about his employees. The appointment was scheduled for Thursday afternoon, 3 days away. In the meantime, I decided to do some more targeted research into Rachel's financial activities. If she was hiding debt from David, she might also be hiding other financial information. I wanted to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with before I took any action. I spent Tuesday morning at the public library, using their computers, to access databases that weren't available on my home internet connection. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, was someone I'd known since David was in elementary school. She'd helped him with research projects over the years and had always been kind to our family. When I explained that I was trying to help my son with some financial planning, she was happy to show me how to navigate the more complex search engines. What I discovered was worse than I'd imagined. Rachel had opened at least 6 credit cards in the past 2 years, all with different banks and financial institutions. The court records I'd found earlier represented only the tip of the iceberg. There were other small claims cases from different jurisdictions, suggesting she'd been moving debt around to avoid comprehensive legal action. More troubling still, I found records indicating that she'd applied for several personal loans using inflated income information. One application, filed just 8 months ago, claimed household income of over $150,000, nearly double what David and Rachel actually earned. The loan had been approved for $25,000, money that had presumably been used to fund their lifestyle while falling further behind on other obligations. By Wednesday evening, I had compiled a file of documents that painted a clear picture of systematic financial deception. Rachel wasn't just overspending or being careless with money. She was actively committing fraud, lying on credit applications, and loan documents to obtain money she couldn't possibly repay based on her real income. The question now was whether David knew about any of this, and if he didn't, how I could tell him without destroying our relationship in the process. Rachel had already driven a wedge between us with her passive-aggressive behavior and deliberate humiliations. If I came forward with accusations about her financial conduct, she'd almost certainly convince David that I was a bitter mother-in-law trying to break up their marriage. But if I didn't come forward, David might lose everything. Their house, his credit, possibly even his job if Rachel's activities somehow implicated the family business connections that Frank had worked so hard to build. The construction company Frank had founded was now run by his former partner, but David still benefited from the reputation Frank had established in the community. Financial scandal could damage those relationships permanently. Thursday afternoon, I sat in Dr. Morrison's dental chair while he examined my teeth, trying to find a natural way to bring up Rachel's employment situation. I didn't have to work very hard to steer the conversation in that direction. Dr. Morrison mentioned how pleased he'd been with Rachel's work, how professional she was with patients, how reliable her attendance had been. "She only works part-time, doesn't she?" I asked during a break in the cleaning procedure. 3 days a week, Dr. Morrison confirmed. She's been very upfront about wanting to maintain work-life balance. Says she and David have other projects they're working on together. Other projects? That was interesting. I wondered what kind of projects would require Rachel to limit her working hours while simultaneously funding an expensive lifestyle. "Business ventures?" I asked casually. Dr. Morrison paused in his work, looking thoughtful. "I'm not entirely sure. She's mentioned something about real estate investing, flipping houses or something like that. Said they were using family money to get started." Family money. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. David didn't have family money beyond what I might eventually leave him, and I certainly hadn't given him anything close to house-flipping money. Frank's inheritance had been substantial, but not enormous, and David knew exactly what I had because I'd been transparent about my financial situation. If Rachel was telling people they had family money for real estate investing, she was either lying to Dr. Morrison or lying to David about where their funding was coming from. Neither possibility was encouraging. "That's wonderful," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "David always did have a good head for business. Takes after his father that way." The cleaning continued in routine fashion, but my mind was racing with this new information. Real estate investing could explain the expensive lifestyle if it was actually happening and actually profitable. But it could also be a cover story for other activities, a way to explain sudden influxes of money that couldn't be accounted for through legitimate employment. When I got home that evening, I began researching property records more systematically, looking for any real estate transactions involving David or Rachel's names. If they were actually flipping houses, there would be a paper trail of purchases and sales, permits and inspections, all the documentation that accompanied legitimate real estate investment. What I found instead was evidence that they'd attempted to purchase 3 different properties in the past year, all of which had fallen through during the financing process. Each failed transaction had required earnest money deposits that were ultimately forfeited when they couldn't secure proper financing. Those deposits, typically 1 to 2% of the purchase price, would have cost them thousands of dollars with nothing to show for it. Far from being successful real estate investors, David and Rachel appeared to be people whose credit was so damaged they couldn't qualify for investment property loans, despite providing documentation of inflated income. The pattern suggested that Rachel had been using the story about real estate investing to cover for her mounting debt, possibly even to justify to David why they needed to take on additional financial obligations. I printed out everything I'd found and organized it into a clear chronological timeline. The picture that emerged was of a young woman who'd gotten in over her head financially and was now using increasingly desperate measures to maintain an unsustainable lifestyle. The coffee incidents, the deliberate humiliations, her obvious desire to push me out of David's life, all of it made sense if she was afraid I might discover what she was hiding. Rachel wasn't just being cruel for the sake of cruelty. She was trying to eliminate anyone who might ask difficult questions about their finances or challenge the stories she was telling. A suspicious mother-in-law with business experience and financial knowledge was exactly the kind of threat she couldn't afford to have in David's life. The question now was what to do with this information. I had enough evidence to prove that Rachel was living far beyond their means and had been dishonest about their financial situation. But proving fraud would require access to documents I couldn't obtain legally, and making accusations I couldn't fully substantiate might backfire in ways that would only hurt David. I needed advice from someone who understood both the legal and emotional complexities of the situation. Someone who could help me figure out how to protect my son without destroying our relationship in the process. I reached for my phone and dialed the number of the one person I trusted to give me honest counsel about what to do next. The person I called was Linda Hartwell, Frank's former attorney and someone who'd become a trusted friend during the difficult months after his death. Linda had helped me navigate the complexities of settling Frank's estate, selling the business, and establishing my financial independence as a widow. More importantly, she'd seen me through some of my darkest moments with the kind of practical wisdom that came from decades of helping families through crises. Linda answered on the second ring, her voice warm with genuine pleasure at hearing from me. "Margaret, what a lovely surprise. How are you holding up?" "I'm well, Linda, thank you, but I'm calling because I need some advice about a delicate family situation. Do you have time to talk? Or should I make an appointment?" "For you, I always have time. What's going on?" I gave her a careful summary of what I'd discovered about David and Rachel's finances, emphasizing the evidence I'd gathered while being clear about the limitations of what I could prove. Linda listened without interruption, asking only occasional clarifying questions about specific documents or timelines. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Margaret, this is potentially serious on several levels. If Rachel is falsifying income information on loan applications, that's federal fraud. If she's doing it with David's knowledge, he could be criminally liable as well. If she's doing it without his knowledge, he could still face civil liability for debts incurred during their marriage. What should I do? I can't just watch my son lose everything because he trusted the wrong person." The first thing you need to understand is that you can't protect David from the consequences of his own choices, even if those choices were based on incomplete information. The second thing is that approaching him directly with these concerns might backfire if Rachel has already been working to undermine your relationship. Linda's words confirmed my own fears about the situation. "So, you think I should just do nothing?" "I think you should be very strategic about how you proceed. David needs to discover this information in a way that doesn't allow Rachel to dismiss it as interference from a meddling mother-in-law. He needs to see the evidence himself, draw his own conclusions, and make his own decisions about what to do." How do I make that happen? By creating circumstances where the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Rachel's spending patterns suggest she's living in a house of cards that's going to collapse eventually. Your job isn't to knock it down yourself, but to make sure David is positioned to see clearly when it falls. Linda suggested I document everything I'd found and store it securely, but avoid confronting either David or Rachel directly until I had more leverage. She also recommended that I begin rebuilding my relationship with David in ways that didn't involve Rachel, creating opportunities for private conversations that might eventually allow me to share my concerns. The key is patience, Linda advised. People like Rachel, who are living beyond their means through deception, always make mistakes eventually. Your job is to be ready when that happens. After our conversation, I felt both relieved to have a plan and frustrated by how passive it seemed. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to warn David immediately, to show him the evidence and demand he confront Rachel about her lies. But Linda was right that such an approach would likely backfire, especially given how successfully Rachel had already positioned herself as the victim of my supposed interference. Instead, I decided to focus on rebuilding my relationship with David while quietly continuing my investigation. If Rachel was committing fraud, there would be more evidence to find. And if her financial house of cards was as unstable as it appeared, she wouldn't be able to maintain the facade much longer. The opportunity to reconnect with David came sooner than I'd expected. He called me on Saturday morning, his voice carrying a note of concern that reminded me of the little boy who used to come to me with scraped knees and hurt feelings. "Mom, I wanted to apologize for what happened at brunch last Sunday. Rachel told me about the coffee accident, and I feel terrible that you had to leave." An accident. Of course, that's how Rachel had described it. "These things happen, sweetheart. I hope everyone enjoyed the party." That's just it, though. It wasn't supposed to be a party. I thought it was going to be just the three of us, and then suddenly there were all these people I barely knew. Rachel said she'd mentioned it to me, but I honestly don't remember agreeing to turn our announcement into a social event. This was interesting. David sounded genuinely confused about how the brunch had evolved from an intimate family gathering into Rachel's showcase event. It suggested that either his memory was failing or Rachel had made the arrangements without fully consulting him. "What was the announcement, if you don't mind me asking?" David hesitated, and I could hear Rachel's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. "Rachel's pregnant, Mom. We're going to have a baby." The news hit me like a physical blow. A grandchild. After years of hoping and wondering, David and Rachel were finally starting a family. Under normal circumstances, this would have been the most joyful news imaginable. But given what I'd learned about their financial situation, it felt more like watching someone add another passenger to a sinking ship. "Oh, David, that's wonderful news," I managed, trying to inject genuine warmth into my voice despite my concerns. "How far along is she?" "About 10 weeks. We wanted to wait until we were past the first trimester to tell everyone, but Rachel was so excited she couldn't keep it secret anymore." 10 weeks. That meant Rachel had known about the pregnancy. When she'd been applying for loans with falsified income information, she'd been planning to bring a child into a household built on financial deception and mounting debt. The thought made me feel physically ill. "I'd love to take you both out to dinner to celebrate," I offered, hoping to create an opportunity for private conversation with David. "That would be great, Mom. Let me check with Rachel about her schedule and get back to you." I hung up, feeling like I was walking a tightrope over an abyss. On one side was my desire to protect David and my future grandchild from financial disaster. On the other was the risk of alienating my son permanently if I mishandled the situation. The pregnancy added urgency to everything, but it also raised the stakes of getting it wrong. Over the next few days, I found myself paying closer attention to young couples with babies, wondering what kind of life awaited my grandchild. Would they grow up in a home filled with financial stress and parental conflict? Would David and Rachel's marriage survive the pressure of mounting debt and a crying infant? Would my grandchild ever know the security and stability that Frank and I had worked so hard to provide for David? The dinner invitation, when it came, included a restriction that immediately raised my suspicions. Rachel had suggested a restaurant called Chez Laurent, one of the most expensive establishments in the city. When I'd gently suggested somewhere more casual, David had insisted that Rachel had her heart set on Chez Laurent because they'd had their first date there. I'd never heard that story before, and something about it struck me as convenient fiction. More likely, Rachel wanted to celebrate their announcement somewhere impressive enough to document on social media, regardless of whether they could afford it. I agreed to the dinner while privately calculating that the evening would probably cost them close to $300, money they didn't actually have to spend. Chez Laurent was exactly as pretentious as I'd expected, with soft lighting, white tablecloths, and prices that made my retirement budget weep. Rachel arrived wearing a new dress that still had the faint crease marks of recent purchase, and David looked uncomfortable in a suit I'd never seen before. They were dressed for an occasion that was important to them, but I suspected they'd gone into debt to afford the proper costumes. The conversation over cocktails was carefully neutral, touching on safe topics like the weather, local news, and Rachel's pregnancy symptoms. She'd already developed the glow that some women got during early pregnancy, and despite my concerns about her character, I couldn't help feeling a stirring of grandmother's pride at the sight of her hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. It wasn't until we were halfway through the main course that David gave me an opening to probe their financial situation. He mentioned that they were starting to look at cribs and baby furniture, marveling at how expensive everything was. "Have you thought about starting a college fund?" I asked. "Frank and I started saving for your education before you could walk. Even small amounts add up over time with compound interest." David and Rachel exchanged a glance that I couldn't quite interpret. "We're still getting our feet under us financially," David said carefully. "The house payments are pretty steep, and we want to make sure we can handle the immediate expenses before we start thinking about college." "Of course," I agreed, "but even $25 a month makes a difference over 18 years. I'd be happy to help you set something up." "That's very generous of you, Margaret," Rachel said, using that formal tone that always made me feel like an outsider. "But we're actually doing quite well. David's been conservative about our financial situation, but my real estate investments have been performing better than expected." "Real estate investments?" There was that story again, told with the kind of confidence that suggested Rachel had convinced herself it was true. I smiled and nodded, filing away another piece of evidence about her willingness to deceive not just David, but his family as well. "How exciting," I said. "What kind of properties are you focusing on?" Rachel launched into a detailed explanation of her supposed investment strategy, describing properties she'd allegedly purchased, renovated, and sold for significant profits. The story was elaborate and convincing, full of specific details about neighborhoods, renovation costs, and market trends. If I hadn't already researched the public records showing her failed purchase attempts, I might have been impressed by her apparent business acumen. David listened with obvious pride as his wife described their growing real estate portfolio. He clearly believed every word of her fabricated success story, and why wouldn't he? She was telling him exactly what any husband would want to hear about his wife's business ventures, that she was smart, successful, and building their financial future. "Maybe you could give me some advice," I suggested. "I've been thinking about diversifying my investments, and real estate has always interested me." Rachel's smile became slightly strained. "It's really a full-time commitment," she said quickly. "I don't think it would be suitable for someone in your situation." "Someone in my situation." The condescension was subtle but unmistakable. Rachel was positioning herself as the financial expert, while dismissing my ability to understand complex investments. It was a clever way to deflect detailed questions while maintaining her image as a successful entrepreneur. But I'd spent enough years helping Frank manage business finances to recognize evasion when I heard it. Real estate investors loved talking about their successes and were usually eager to share strategies with other potential investors. Rachel's reluctance to discuss specifics suggested she was afraid of being caught in inconsistencies. The evening continued with Rachel dominating the conversation, describing their plans for the baby's nursery, her ideas for maternity fashion, and her vision for their expanding family. David contributed occasional comments, but mostly listened with the expression of a man who was deeply in love and slightly overwhelmed by his wife's energy and ambition. When the check arrived, David reached for his wallet immediately, but I noticed the slight hesitation as he calculated the tip. The total was just over $250, exactly as I'd predicted, and I could see him mentally adjusting the tip downward to keep the evening under $300. It was the kind of calculation that people made when they were living, paycheck to paycheck while trying to maintain appearances. "Let me contribute," I offered, reaching for my purse. "Absolutely not," David said firmly. "This is our treat. We wanted to celebrate with you." Rachel's expression suggested she would have been perfectly happy to accept my contribution, but David's pride wouldn't allow it. He paid the bill with a credit card, and I noticed that he chose carefully from several cards in his wallet, suggesting he was managing multiple accounts and rotating balances to stay within credit limits. As we walked to our cars, Rachel linked her arm through David's and chattered happily about how perfect the evening had been, how wonderful it was that we could all spend time together like a real family. Her performance of contentment was flawless, but I'd seen the calculation behind her choices throughout the evening. The expensive restaurant, the designer dress, the elaborate stories about business success, all of it was carefully crafted to project an image of prosperity and sophistication. But I'd also seen David's hesitation over the tip, his careful selection of credit cards, and his obvious discomfort with the restaurant's prices. Whatever financial picture Rachel was painting for the outside world, David was clearly feeling the strain of maintaining it. Over the following weeks, I made a point of staying in closer contact with David, calling regularly to check on Rachel's pregnancy and offering assistance with baby preparations. I was careful to keep the conversations light and supportive, focusing on my excitement about becoming a grandmother rather than probing into their personal affairs. But I also continued my financial investigation, expanding my research to include more detailed analysis of their spending patterns and debt obligations. What I discovered painted an increasingly alarming picture of a household spiraling toward financial disaster. The credit card debt I'd initially uncovered was worse than I'd realized. By cross-referencing court records from multiple jurisdictions, I found evidence of at least 12 different credit accounts in Rachel's name, with combined balances that likely exceeded $60,000. The monthly minimum payments alone would consume most of her part-time income, leaving nothing for actual living expenses. More troubling still, I found records suggesting that Rachel had recently applied for additional credit using David's social security number and employment information. If those applications had been approved, David might be legally liable for debts he didn't even know existed. The pattern that emerged was of someone in complete financial freefall, using increasingly desperate measures to maintain an unsustainable lifestyle. Rachel wasn't just overspending or being careless with money. She was systematically destroying both her own and David's financial futures to preserve an illusion of prosperity that she could no longer afford to maintain. I also began paying closer attention to their social media presence, documenting the expensive purchases and activities that Rachel continued to showcase despite their mounting debt. There were photos from a weekend spa retreat that must have cost over $1,000, shopping trips that resulted in armloads of designer bags, and restaurant meals at establishments that charged $50 per person for lunch. Each post was carefully staged to suggest effortless affluence, but I could now see the desperation behind the facade. Rachel wasn't documenting a genuinely prosperous lifestyle. She was creating evidence of prosperity that existed only in photographs, funded by credit cards she couldn't afford to pay and loans she'd obtained through fraud. The question was no longer whether Rachel was deceiving David about their finances. The question was how much longer she could maintain the deception before everything collapsed around them. And when that collapse came, I wanted to make sure David was prepared to protect himself and his child from the worst consequences of his wife's financial recklessness. I began preparing a comprehensive file of everything I'd discovered, organizing it chronologically and including copies of all the public records I'd accessed. Linda had been right about the need for patience, but she'd also stressed the importance of being ready when the opportunity came to present evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. That opportunity was coming sooner than I'd expected. Rachel's house of cards was showing signs of structural damage, and I was beginning to see cracks in the foundation that she wouldn't be able to repair much longer. The beginning of the end came on a Tuesday morning in November, when David called me at 7 a.m, his voice tight with panic. "Mom, I need your help. Something's wrong with our bank account, and I don't understand what's happening." I'd been expecting this call for weeks, though I'd hoped it would come in a way that allowed me to guide David toward the truth gradually. Instead, Rachel's financial deceptions had apparently reached a tipping point that demanded immediate crisis management. "What kind of problem, sweetheart?" "Our mortgage payment bounced yesterday. The bank called me at work to tell me we're 30 days behind, but that's impossible. I set up automatic payments months ago, and I've been watching our account balance to make sure there was always enough money." I could hear Rachel's voice in the background, urgent and defensive, though I couldn't make out her specific words. David continued, his frustration evident. "Rachel says there must be some kind of banking error, that maybe someone stole our account information. But when I tried to log into our online banking this morning, our savings account is completely empty. We had almost $8,000 in there just last week." $8,000 was more than David and Rachel should have been able to save given their legitimate income and known expenses. Its sudden disappearance confirmed my suspicions that Rachel had been moving money around to cover her mounting debts, probably using David's savings to make minimum payments on credit cards he didn't know existed. "Have you spoken to someone?" "At the bank?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm despite the alarm bells ringing in my head. "That's where I'm going now. Rachel can't come with me because she has to work, but I'm hoping they can explain what happened. Mom, if we can't get this sorted out, we could lose the house. With the baby coming and everything, I don't know what we'll do." The genuine fear in his voice broke my heart. David had inherited Frank's sense of responsibility and his belief that financial problems could always be solved through honest work and careful planning. He had no experience with the kind of systematic deception that Rachel had been orchestrating, and he was completely unprepared for the reality he was about to discover. "David, before you go to the bank, I want you to do something for me. I want you to pull your credit report and look at all the accounts listed under your name. You can do it online for free." "Why would I need to do that? I know what accounts I have." This was the moment I'd been dreading and preparing for. Because sometimes people we trust make financial decisions that affect us without our knowledge. I'm not saying that's what happened, but you need to have complete information before you talk to the bank. There was a long pause, and I could hear Rachel's voice becoming more insistent in the background. "Rachel thinks that's a waste of time. She says we should focus on the banking error instead of going down rabbit holes." Of course, Rachel thought it was a waste of time. She knew exactly what David would find if he looked at his credit report, and it wasn't a banking error. "David, as someone who helped your father manage business finances for 30 years, I'm telling you that the first rule of financial crisis management is to understand the full scope of the problem. You can't solve what you don't fully understand." My reference to Frank seemed to carry weight with him. "Okay, Mom, I'll pull the credit report first, then go to the bank. But if this is just a computer glitch somewhere, I'm going to feel pretty stupid." "Better to feel stupid than to be blindsided," I replied. "Call me after you've had a chance to review everything." I spent the rest of the morning pacing my apartment, trying to prepare myself for the conversation that was coming. David was about to discover that his wife had been lying to him about virtually every aspect of their financial life. He was going to learn that the woman he loved and trusted had been systematically destroying his financial future while he worked long hours to support their household. The call came at 11:30, and David's voice was completely different from the panicked but hopeful tone of our earlier conversation. Now he sounded hollow, defeated, like someone who'd just watched his entire world collapse. "Mom, I need to come over. I can't talk about this on the phone, and I can't go home right now. Rachel's going to be there for lunch, and I don't think I can face her until I figure out what to do. Of course, sweetheart. Come whenever you're ready. He arrived 20 minutes later, carrying a manila folder thick with papers and wearing the expression of someone who'd aged a decade in a single morning. I made coffee and sat down across from him at my kitchen table, the same table where Frank and I had solved countless problems over the years. It's bad, Mom. It's really, really bad. David opened the folder and spread out papers that told the story I'd already pieced together through my own investigation. Credit card statements showing balances I'd never imagined. Loan documents with forged income information. Bank records revealing a pattern of cash advances, balance transfers, and minimum payments that had been going on for months. She opened 17 different credit cards using our joint income information, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. Some of them I never even knew existed. The total debt is over $80,000, and that's not counting the personal loans. $80,000 was even worse than I'd calculated. That amount of debt, combined with their existing mortgage and car payments, meant they were spending nearly twice their actual income every month just to service their obligations. The savings account wasn't stolen from, David continued. Rachel's been transferring money out of it regularly to make minimum payments on cards I didn't know about. She's been juggling everything for months, moving money around to keep any one account from going into default. How long has this been going on? David shuffled through the papers, his hands shaking slightly. Based on what I can see here, she started opening accounts about 6 months after we got married. The spending got worse after we bought the house, and it's been completely out of control since she found out about the pregnancy. I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. David, I'm so sorry. I know how much this must hurt. I keep thinking about all the times. She told me we were doing fine financially, all her stories about real estate investments and family money. I believed every word of it because why would she lie about something like that? Because she was in too deep to tell the truth, I thought. But there was no point in saying that now. David was devastated enough without me adding commentary about Rachel's character flaws. What did the bank tell you? That we're 3 months behind on the mortgage, not 1 month like I thought. Rachel's been telling me she paid it, but she's only been making partial payments. We're already in the foreclosure process. We have 60 days to bring the account current or we lose the house. The timeline was even tighter than I'd feared. Bringing the mortgage current would require at least $12,000. Money they didn't have and couldn't borrow given their destroyed credit. There's more, David said, pulling out another stack of papers. I found out that Rachel used my social security number to apply for 3 different personal loans without telling me. I'm legally responsible for those debts even though I never saw a penny of the money. This was the scenario Linda had warned me about, where David could face both civil and criminal liability for loans he'd never authorized. If prosecutors decided he'd been complicit in the fraud, he could face serious legal consequences. Have you spoken to a lawyer? I called the legal aid office, but they can't see me until next week. Mom, I don't know what to do. If I confront Rachel about this, she's going to deny everything or blame me somehow. If I don't confront her, she's going to keep making things worse. And there's the baby to think about now. David looked at me, with the same expression he'd worn as a child when problems seemed too big for him to handle alone. But this wasn't a scraped knee or a failed test that parental comfort could fix. This was adult devastation that would require difficult choices and painful consequences. What do you want to do? I asked, hoping to help him think through his options rather than making decisions for him. I want to wake up and discover this. Was all a nightmare, he said with a bitter laugh. But since that's not going to happen, I guess I want to understand how she could do this to us. To me. To our baby. I pulled out my own folder, the one I'd been assembling for weeks with copies of public records and documented evidence of Rachel's deception. David, there are some things I need to show you. I've been worried about your financial situation for a while, and I did some research on my own. His eyes widened as he saw the thickness of my file. You knew about this? I suspected something was wrong with your finances based on the lifestyle you were living compared to your documented income. I didn't know about the specific debts or the fraud, but I knew the numbers didn't add up. I walked him through my findings chronologically, showing him the court records, the failed real estate purchases, the pattern of applications with inflated income information. David listened in silence, occasionally asking questions about where I'd found specific documents or how I'd accessed certain records. Why didn't you tell me? He asked when I finished. Because I was afraid you wouldn't. Believe me, because I was afraid Rachel would convince you I was trying to interfere in your marriage, because I hoped I was wrong about what I was seeing. David stared at the papers spread across my kitchen table, financial evidence of a marriage built on lies and a future mortgaged for the sake of maintaining appearances. She's pregnant, Mom. We're going to have a baby in 6 months, and I don't even know if I can trust her to tell me the truth about when the baby's due. The pain in his voice was almost unbearable. This wasn't just financial betrayal. This was the destruction of everything David had believed about his marriage, his wife, and his future. What are you going to do? I asked gently. I don't know. I can't afford to divorce her because I can't afford the legal fees. I can't afford to stay married to her because she's destroying my credit and potentially exposing me to criminal liability. I can't afford to keep the house, but I can't afford to sell it either because we owe more than it's worth. David was trapped in the kind of financial nightmare that destroyed families and derailed lives. Every option available to him came with consequences he couldn't afford, both financially and emotionally. There might be another way, I said carefully, but it would require you to take some very difficult steps, and it would mean accepting that your marriage as you understood it is probably over. I'm listening. I explained what Linda had told me about financial fraud cases, about the importance of documenting everything and cooperating with authorities to minimize his legal exposure. I talked about the possibility of negotiating with creditors to settle debts for less than their full value, about bankruptcy as a last resort, about the long process of rebuilding credit and financial stability. But I also talked about the baby, about the responsibility he would have as a father regardless of what happened to his marriage. Rachel's deceptions had created a crisis, but they hadn't eliminated his obligation to provide for his child. The first thing you need to do is protect yourself legally, I continued. That means documenting everything, separating your finances from Rachel's as much as possible, and probably consulting with a criminal defense attorney about your exposure for those loans you didn't authorize. I can't afford a criminal defense attorney. You can't afford not to have one. David, if prosecutors think you were involved in loan fraud, you could go to prison. Your child could be born while you're facing federal charges. The reality of his situation was sinking in, and I could see him struggling to process the magnitude of what he was facing. This wasn't just about money or credit scores. This was about the fundamental structure of his adult life, all of which had been built on Rachel's deceptions. Will you help me? He asked, his voice small and uncertain. Of course I will. Whatever you need, however long it takes, we'll figure this out together. But even as I made that promise, I knew that helping David navigate this crisis would require resources I wasn't sure I had. The legal fees alone could consume a significant portion of my retirement savings. The emotional cost of watching my son suffer through the consequences of trusting the wrong person would be almost unbearable. Still, he was my child, and Frank had always said that parents don't get to choose which problems their children bring to them. They only get to choose whether they'll be there to help solve them. David spent the rest of the afternoon at my apartment, making phone calls to banks and creditors, trying to understand the full scope of the damage Rachel had done. Each conversation revealed new debts, new lies, new evidence of systematic financial fraud that had been hidden beneath the surface of their apparently successful marriage. By evening, we had compiled a complete picture of their financial situation. And it was even worse than David's morning discoveries had suggested. The total debt exceeded $90,000 when all accounts were included. Their monthly debt service obligations were more than 3 times David's take-home pay. Even if Rachel returned to full-time work immediately after the baby was born, they couldn't generate enough income to service their existing obligations, let alone pay for housing, food, and childcare. "She has to know this is unsustainable," David said as we reviewed the final calculations. "She has to know that we can't keep this up much longer." "I think she's been hoping something would happen to solve the problem," I replied. "A big real estate deal, a lottery ticket, a relative leaving an inheritance. People who get this deep in debt often develop magical thinking about how they'll eventually get out. Or maybe she was planning to divorce me and leave me holding all the debt while she started over somewhere else." The thought had occurred to me as well, though I hadn't wanted to suggest it. Rachel's pattern of isolating David from his family, combined with her willingness to use his identity for fraudulent loans, suggested someone who might be preparing an exit strategy that left him responsible for debts she'd created. "We'll probably never know what she was thinking," I said. "The important thing now is protecting you and the baby from the consequences of her choices." David nodded, but I could see the exhaustion and despair in his expression. He was 28 years old, expecting his first child and facing financial ruin because he'd trusted someone who had systematically betrayed that trust. The road ahead would be long and difficult, even with my help and support. "I have to go home eventually," he said, as darkness fell outside my windows. "Rachel will be wondering where I've been all day." "What are you going to tell her?" "The truth. That I know about the debts, the lies, the fraud, all of it. I'm going to ask her to explain how she thought this was going to end, and then I'm going to tell her what has to happen next." "Which is?" David straightened his shoulders, and for a moment I saw Frank's determination in his expression. "Complete financial transparency from now on. All accounts in both our names. All major purchases approved by both of us. And immediate counseling to figure out if there's any way to save this marriage. And if she refuses, then I'll know that the woman I married never really existed, and I'll have to figure out how to protect myself and my child from someone who's willing to destroy us both to maintain her lifestyle." It was a reasonable plan, though I suspected Rachel would choose manipulation over honesty when confronted with evidence of her deceptions. She'd invested too much in her image of prosperity to abandon it easily, even when maintaining it had become impossible. David gathered up his papers and prepared to leave, but I could see his reluctance to face the conversation waiting for him at home. "Mom, whatever happens tonight, I want you to know that I'm grateful you were paying attention when I was too blind to see what was happening." "I love you, sweetheart. We'll get through this together, whatever it takes." After he left, I sat in my quiet apartment, thinking about the conversation he was about to have with Rachel and what it might mean for all of us. The financial crisis was real and immediate, but the deeper crisis was about trust, honesty, and whether a marriage could survive the kind of systematic deception Rachel had practiced for 2 years. I suspected that by tomorrow morning, my son's life would be completely different, and mine would be as well. The question was whether the changes would ultimately lead to healing and rebuilding, or to further destruction and pain for everyone involved. David called me at 11:30 that night, his voice flat and emotionless in a way that told me everything I needed to know about how the confrontation with Rachel had gone. "It's over, Mom. The marriage, the house, everything. Rachel's gone." I'd been lying awake expecting this call, but hearing the words still felt like a punch to the chest. "What happened?" "She denied everything at first. Said the credit card. Statements must be fake, that someone had stolen her identity. that I was crazy for believing documents I'd printed off the internet. She was so convincing that for about 5 minutes I started doubting what I'd seen with my own eyes. David's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd spent hours being gaslit by a professional manipulator. Then I showed her the bank records. The loan applications with my social security number, the court documents about the lawsuits. She couldn't explain those away, so she switched tactics. What kind of tactics? She said it was all for us, for our future, that she'd been trying to build something better than the small, limited life I was content with. She said I had no ambition, no vision, and that someone had to make the hard choices to ensure our family had the lifestyle we deserved. I could picture Rachel delivering this speech, probably with tears in her eyes and her hand resting protectively over her pregnant belly. It was a masterful piece of manipulation, turning her systematic fraud into a sacrifice she'd made for their benefit. She said the coffee incidents were accidents, that I was paranoid if I thought she was doing it on purpose. But then she said, maybe it was good that you were finally out of our lives because you were holding us back with your small-town thinking and depression about Dad's death. The casual cruelty of that comment took my breath away. Rachel had targeted my grief about Frank, turning my natural sadness about losing my husband into a weapon against my relationship with David. It was the kind of psychological warfare that revealed the depth of her callousness. When I told her I wanted complete financial transparency and marriage counseling, she laughed. Actually laughed, Mom. She said she wasn't going to live like a prisoner in her own home, having her every purchase monitored by someone who was too weak to appreciate what she'd accomplished. Where is she now? Packed a bag and left around 10 o'clock. Said she was going to stay with her sister in Phoenix until I came to my senses. She took her jewelry, her expensive clothes, and about $400 in cash from my wallet. Even in leaving, Rachel had managed to take what didn't belong to her. The $400 was probably all the ready cash David had, money he'd need for groceries and gas while sorting out the financial wreckage she'd left behind. Are you okay? I asked, though it was obvious he wasn't. I keep thinking about the baby. She's carrying my child, and I don't even know if I'll ever see them after they're born. She could disappear anywhere, start over with a new identity, and I'd never find them. This fear was probably Rachel's insurance policy. As long as she was pregnant with David's child, she held leverage over him. She could use the baby as collateral to negotiate favorable terms for herself, or as a weapon to punish him if he refused to cooperate with her plans. David, you need to document everything that happened tonight. Write down exactly what she said, when she left, what she took with her. If this turns into a custody battle, you'll need evidence of her behavior. I can't afford a custody battle. I can't afford anything anymore. The despair in his voice was heartbreaking, but I could also hear something else beneath it. Relief, perhaps, that the constant stress of living with someone who'd been systematically lying to him was finally over. Whatever pain Rachel's departure had caused, it had also removed the immediate threat of further financial destruction. Come stay with me tomorrow, I offered. We'll start figuring out what comes next. The following morning, David arrived at my apartment with a single suitcase and a box of important documents. He looked like he'd aged 5 years overnight, but there was something clearer in his expression than I'd seen in months. The confusion and self-doubt that had clouded his features during our recent conversations had been replaced by a grim determination to face reality head-on. We spent the morning making phone calls to banks and creditors, documenting the extent of Rachel's fraud and David's unwitting involvement. The conversation with the mortgage company was particularly difficult. They were sympathetic to David's situation, but unwilling to modify the loan terms without Rachel's cooperation, since her name was also on the deed. The personal loan companies were more helpful, especially when David explained that he'd never received any of the money and had copies of the applications showing forged signatures. 2 of the 3 loans were flagged for fraud investigation, which might eventually remove David's liability, but would also likely result in criminal charges against Rachel. By noon, we had a clearer picture of David's legal and financial situation. The house would go into foreclosure unless they could pay the $12,000 needed to bring the mortgage current. The credit card debt was entirely in Rachel's name, which meant David wasn't legally responsible for it. But the joint accounts she'd emptied would take months to recover through the courts. Most importantly, David's own credit hadn't been completely destroyed. Rachel had been careful to keep most of her fraudulent accounts separate from his legitimate credit history, probably to protect her own ability to continue borrowing. With careful management and legal assistance, David could rebuild his financial life within a few years. "I want to file for divorce immediately," David said after we'd finished the financial assessment. "I don't want her to have any claim on anything I earn from now on, and I don't want to be responsible for any new debts she creates." "What about the baby?" David's expression tightened. "I'll establish paternity and fight for custody when the time comes. But I'm not going to let the possibility of a relationship with my child trap me in a marriage with someone who's already proven she'll destroy both of us to get what she wants." It was a mature decision, though I knew it was costing him emotionally. David had always wanted to be a father, and the idea of his child growing up in a broken home went against everything he believed about family stability. Linda Hartwell was able to see us that afternoon, and she confirmed what we'd already suspected about David's legal situation. The divorce would be straightforward since Rachel had abandoned the marriage, and most of the assets were jointly owned debts rather than valuable property. The custody issue would be more complex, especially if Rachel remained in another state, but David's documentation of her fraud would work in his favor. "The key is staying ahead of this," Linda advised. "File for divorce immediately, document everything, and cooperate fully with any fraud investigations. Don't try to protect Rachel from the consequences of her choices, even for the sake of the baby. A child needs at least one parent who's financially stable and emotionally honest." Over the following weeks, David moved into my spare bedroom, while he sorted out his living situation. I'd expected this arrangement to be temporary, but as the days passed, I realized how much I'd missed having him in my daily life. Not the desperate, confused version of David who'd been struggling to understand his wife's behavior, but the real David who'd been hidden beneath months of stress and manipulation. He threw himself into rebuilding his financial life with the same determination Frank had shown when starting his business. David found a second job doing bookkeeping for small businesses in the evenings, work that utilized skills he'd developed at the marketing agency. He moved his belongings out of the house before the foreclosure proceedings were complete, selling what he could and storing the rest in my apartment's storage unit. Most surprisingly, he started cooking again, something he'd loved doing before. Rachel had taken over their kitchen with her expensive appliances and elaborate entertaining plans. Simple meals that reminded me of the young man who'd experimented with recipes during his college years, before he'd learned to see his own interests as insufficiently sophisticated. Rachel called twice during the first month, both times demanding that David withdraw the divorce petition and agree to work things out for the sake of their unborn child. She'd apparently found a job in Phoenix and was living with her sister, though she refused to provide a permanent address for legal documents. Her tone during these conversations was alternately pleading and threatening, but never apologetic for the financial devastation she'd caused. "She keeps saying she did it all for us," David told me after the second call. "Like stealing my identity and destroying my credit was some kind of gift I should be grateful for." "Do you miss her?" I asked, genuinely curious about his emotional state. David considered the question seriously. "I miss the person I thought she was, the woman who was smart and ambitious and wanted to build a life with me. But I don't think that person ever really existed. I think Rachel was always someone who saw me as a means to an end, someone who could provide respectability and financial stability while she pursued whatever lifestyle she thought she deserved." His insight into Rachel's character was remarkably clear for someone who'd been so thoroughly deceived. The David who'd been willing to overlook obvious warning signs rather than face uncomfortable truths about his marriage had been replaced by someone who insisted on seeing reality clearly, even when it was painful. The most difficult conversation came in December, when Rachel called to inform David that she'd given birth to a daughter 3 weeks premature. The baby was healthy, but Rachel was demanding immediate financial support and threatening to prevent David from seeing his child unless he agreed to reconcile. She named her Sophia Grace, David told me, his voice thick with emotion. She's beautiful, Mom. Rachel sent me pictures and she has Frank's eyes. The manipulation was breathtaking in its cruelty. Rachel had used the birth of David's daughter as leverage in their ongoing conflict, calculating that his love for his child would overcome his anger about her financial betrayal. She'd even chosen names that honored our family's heritage, probably hoping to create additional emotional pressure. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I'm going to Phoenix next weekend to meet my daughter and establish a relationship with her. But I'm not going to pretend that changes anything between Rachel and me. She made her choices, and now she has to live with the consequences." David's trip to Phoenix was emotionally devastating and legally productive. He spent 2 days with baby Sophia, falling completely in love with the tiny person who carried his genetic legacy into the future. But he also documented Rachel's living situation, her continued irresponsible spending despite having a newborn, and her obvious expectation that David would financially support both her and the baby regardless of their relationship status. She's living in a studio apartment and spending money on designer baby clothes while claiming she can't afford proper nutrition for herself, David reported when he returned. She bought a $1,000 stroller but doesn't have a car seat that meets safety standards. The pattern was depressingly familiar. Rachel was still prioritizing image over substance, still choosing expensive purchases that photographed well over practical necessities that would actually benefit her child. But David had also secured legal representation in Arizona and filed for emergency custody based on concerns about Rachel's financial instability and history of fraud. The process would take months to resolve, but at least Sophia's welfare was now a matter of official court supervision. The resolution came faster than anyone expected. In February, Rachel was arrested for credit card fraud related to accounts she'd opened using false information in Phoenix. The charges were serious enough to result in actual jail time, and her sister was unwilling to take responsibility for baby Sophia while Rachel was incarcerated. David flew to Phoenix immediately and brought Sophia home to live with us while Rachel awaited trial. The tiny apartment that had seemed perfectly adequate for a retired widow and her temporarily displaced son suddenly felt crowded with baby equipment and the constant needs of a newborn. But I'd never been happier about anything in my life. Sophia was indeed beautiful, with Frank's distinctive blue-green eyes and David's serious expression. She was also remarkably alert for such a young baby, studying faces intently and responding to voices with the kind of focused attention that suggested exceptional intelligence. "She's going to be brilliant," I told David as I rocked her to sleep one evening. "Just like her grandfather." "I hope she's going to be honest," David replied. "That's more important than being smart." By spring, David had established a routine that balanced his work responsibilities with single parenting, aided by my enthusiastic participation in childcare duties. Rachel was eventually sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for credit card fraud, a term that would likely be reduced for good behavior, but would still keep her out of Sophia's life during the most critical early months. The divorce was finalized while Rachel was in prison, with David receiving full custody of Sophia and no obligation to provide spousal support to someone serving time for financial crimes. Rachel's parental rights were suspended pending her release and successful completion of financial counseling and parenting classes. 6 months after that terrible November morning when David had discovered the truth about his marriage, we were living as a 3-generation household that actually worked. David had recovered financially and emotionally from Rachel's betrayal. Sophia was thriving under the care of two adults who prioritized her welfare over their own convenience. And I had rediscovered the joy of being needed by the people I loved most. The coffee stains had long since been cleaned from my white silk blouse, though I'd never worn it again. It hung in my closet as a reminder of how a moment of deliberate cruelty had ultimately led to the exposure of much deeper problems. Rachel's petty attempts to humiliate me had backfired spectacularly, revealing the financial fraud that might have destroyed David's future if it had remained hidden much longer. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I'd confronted Rachel directly about her behavior instead of conducting my careful investigation. Would David have believed me? Would Rachel have been more cautious about her fraud if she'd known I was watching? Would their marriage have survived if the truth had come out gradually instead of all at once? But mostly, I was grateful that my instincts had been correct, that my decision to protect David by gathering evidence instead of making accusations had ultimately given him the information he needed to protect himself and his daughter. Frank had always said that the truth has a way of surfacing when you're patient enough to let it emerge naturally, and he'd been right about that, as he'd been right about so many things. David was rebuilding his life on a foundation of honesty and careful planning, values that would serve him well as he raised Sophia. My granddaughter would grow up understanding the importance of living within your means, of choosing substance over appearance, of surrounding yourself with people who loved you for who you were rather than what you could provide. As for Rachel, I honestly didn't spend much time thinking about her anymore. She'd made her choices and was living with the consequences. My focus was on the future David and Sophia were building together, on the family we'd become through crisis and healing, on the quiet satisfaction of a life lived according to principles that could withstand any storm. The coffee stains were gone, but the lesson remained. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not with dramatic confrontations, but with patient investigation, careful documentation, and the courage to speak truth when the moment demands it. Rachel had underestimated the depth of a mother's love and the power of a grandmother's determination to protect her family. She wouldn't make that mistake again. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.